Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us for our annual new member orientation. I am Tristan Winkler. I am the director of the French Broad River Metropolitan Planning Organization. Your first acronym of what will be far too many today, MPO. So fair warning, lots and lots of acronyms headed your way. Why don't we start with a quick round of introductions? I can just, why don't we start online? Stefan, do you want to go first?
Hello, everyone. Stephen Sparks, NCDOT Division 13.
Thanks, Stefan. U06025, I believe that's Commissioner Ball.
Hey, folks. Commissioner Drew Ball, Buncombe County, District 3. Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. Ada McGovern.
Hey everyone, I'm Ada McGovern. I'm the Safe Routes to School coordinator for the Land of Sky region.
Like everything.
Kevin Webb.
Hey, this is Kevin Webb from the town of Mills River. I'm a planning technician.
Thanks for joining us. Commissioner Stevens.
Howdy everyone, Drew Stevens here from town of Biltmore Forest. I've attended 2 meetings. I appreciate and looking forward to it. I'm the other Drew on the call. Hello, Drew. And I do need to sneak out from 2 to 3.
Sounds good. We will be recording, so you won't miss a minute. And Daniel Sellers.
Hello all, I'm Daniel Sellers. I'm with the NCDOT and the planning branch from Raleigh. I help coordinate MPO services on our end.
Commissioner Egolf.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Tristan. My name is Jay Egolf, Henderson County Commissioner. Welcome. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Councilmember Moore.
Hello. Hey, this is Jeff Moore, Town of Mills River, and I'll probably have to get a lot of this on the recording because I got some traveling to do, but I'm excited to be here and thanks for having this.
Well, thank you very much for joining, and I think you might know most of this stuff already, so I'm not too worried. Chloe Donahoe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chloe Donahoe. I'm a transportation planner with Buncombe County, and I joined. I started my position in June, and so I'm newer to the MPO as well. So it's nice to meet everybody.
William High.
Hello, I'm William High. I'm the lead transportation planner for Buncombe County.
Emily Whitmire.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Whitmire. I'm with the Flat Rock Village Council. I'm a new council member there.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Is there anyone online that I missed? Okay. In the room, Sandy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, in the
I'm
room,
in the room and online. Cool. Hi, I'm Sandy Broadwell. I am the Transportation Demand Management Coordinator for the Land of Sky Regional Council. I'm Hannah Bagley. I'm a Transportation Planner with the MPO.
Sheila Franklin, Commissioner for Henderson County.
B.T. O'Connor, I'm a Transportation Planner for the MPO.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us. Again, this will be recorded for your reference. Just a note, we try to keep this relatively high level. There's still a lot. When I first started at the MPO, I think our orientation was roughly 7 hours long. people have largely begged that we reduce that amount of time, and we're trying to do so. But at the same time, you know, a lot of the items that we're going to go over, we're just touching on. If you have more specific questions, or if you have questions of any type, please feel free to jump in. Again, this is mostly a high-level orientation, so we can dive into whatever folks are more interested in. So to get into it, what we're going to cover today, what is an MPO, a little bit on the history of MPOs, MPO requirements, MPO structure, the planning documents, funding. I'm saving the most fun for last, or near the last, and then some policies and trends to go over. A little bit of what to expect. You will learn a little bit about a number of topics at the MPO. There is a lot to metropolitan planning. I tell people nothing we do is rocket science, but a lot of this stuff, it does take time to sink in. It is okay to ask questions. I'll just note, I try to make a point of getting coffee with people rolling off our board. And one thing I hear a lot is that people are worried about asking questions because they don't understand something. They're worried they're the only ones. I've heard that from dozens of people. It's okay to ask questions. So there is no stupid question. What not to expect. This training, believe it or not, is not going to cover absolutely everything. So there are things that we do that we have a lot more focus on that we're not going to cover all of it. And you will not know everything there is to know about metropolitan planning at the end of this. And don't expect that being totally silent is going to be helpful, unless you know this stuff already. And also, don't expect that our meetings will be brief and comprehensive. That is another piece of feedback I regularly get. Our meetings need to be shorter and go into more detail. It's a very difficult balance. But all in all, our job is to provide information for our decision makers so that you guys can make the best possible decisions for our region. So a couple of things to know off the bat. First of all, projects don't move quickly. A lot of the transportation projects that we talk about in the region, we've been talking about for a long time. So if anyone has the expectation of joining the MPO and expecting to get a project funded and having a ribbon cutting later this year, I want to disappoint you from the start so you aren't disappointed later. It's a process. There are hundreds of identified projects out there that are in some point of the planning process. So just know projects don't move quickly. The other important thing to know is that no project, at least that I've ever encountered, makes every single person happy. I kind of hate to say it, that is just part of transportation projects. There's a lot of different ways to look at transportation projects and transportation needs, and not every project that moves forward is going to make people happy. But at the same time, we shouldn't be trying to make people unhappy either. It's a difficult balance. And the last bit of intro is funding is a key issue. It's an increasingly key issue. So a lot of times it's, there's one part of the question, is this a good project? But the other part is something that we can't forget about. It's not just, is this a good project or not? Again, there's hundreds of projects identified across the region. But what the next part is this project a good use of our limited resources? And so that's something we like to get into with some of our planning processes. So what is an MPO? All in all, I think a lot of people who first join us, they know that an MPO or a metropolitan planning organization has something to do with transportation. Not totally clear what, and that is okay. But I think the most simple way that I've seen it described, trying to get it down to one sentence, is in the federal regs. And that is that the MPO is a forum for cooperative transportation decision-making for the metropolitan planning area. So to unpack that a little bit, the Forum for Cooperative Transportation Decision-Making, what does that really mean? I've got a terrible food-related metaphor that really the MPO is a sandwich, all these different ingredients of decision makers. But really, the MPO's job is to get different stakeholders together, whether that's NCDOT, federal highways, federal transit, public transit providers, elected officials, local staff, the public, and other stakeholders. Our job is to bring people together and help make decisions about what improves the region's transportation network. And something I like to point out, a lot of people sometimes ask, who is the MPO? What's my role? And again, the MPO is a partnership. So board members, TCC members, anyone involved in the MPO is you. And so, you know, everyone has a part to play in the forum and making decisions. I'll also note that we rely heavily on our local governments, both to provide the local perspective as well as relay information about what's going on at the MPO. So I'll note that that is one thing that we find very important as the MPO. We are not really a headliner for a lot of events and things of that nature. For us, when we go out to the public, it is immensely more effective if our local governments are helping to get the word out and helping to make people aware of what's going on. And so that is kind of part of the process. It's both as a board member, as a TCC member, bringing what you're hearing from your local communities to the MPO. And it's also what's happening, you know, if we're talking about potential projects, bringing that back to your councils, to your folks, and making sure that they're aware of what's going on. That's a big part of the process. So a few documents that determine how the forum, that is the MPO, and how it works. One of those documents is the Memorandum of Understanding. That's a document that we just recently updated that highlights who is part of the MPO and who gets to sit at the board and help make those decisions, who gets a vote, how many votes. Also our bylaws, so our board and TCC as well as our subcommittees have bylaws that determine voting and membership and other procedures. And our public involvement policy, which sets the minimal amount of public involvement required for MPO tasks. And that is a federally required document. So all in all, the MPO as a forum, the way that kind of looks in terms of workflow, a lot of the work that we do comes out of federal requirements, state requirements, subcommittee and work group items, and also member and stakeholder requests. That goes into our technical coordinating committee, also known as the TCC, and that goes to the MPO board. And what gets decided at the MPO board is essentially the final decision that goes into our policy documents. And in terms of just the difference between the board and the TCC, again, the board are kind of the final decision makers. The MPO board is made up mostly of elected officials. But also to note, it includes NCDOT Board of Transportation representatives, and we have 2 seats for transit representation as well, which usually are filled by elected officials, but not always. Just a side note, just my perspective, a lot of times you'll hear our board referred to as the TAC. We try to get away from that. That's the Transportation Advisory Committee. We've, just to note, the MPO's job isn't necessarily to give advice. We are an agency or an organization that is a required part of getting federal transportation funds to the region. There's no advice column coming out of the MPO. So we generally refer to it as the MPO board. And then the MPO TCC, that is a body that roughly mirrors the MPO board. That is made up mostly of local government staff, including NCDOT and transit representatives. There's also a number of other related seats, including Land to Sky Regional Council, Southwestern RPO, Land to Sky RPO, and the Buncombe County Air Quality Agency. But their job is to advise the MPO board on decisions that go to them. So the MPO board, again, the final decision maker, and we have them meet about a week after the TCC. So just a best practice that I like to recommend is, if you aren't doing it already, we advise having our TCC and board members meet kind of in that week between meetings, just so our board members know what's coming and can get the perspective of their local government representatives. I think with the folks that have started doing that, I've heard that it's very helpful, but just my 2 cents. And a little bit on the MPO board and TCC, we have chairs and vice chairs that are elected to a maximum of 2 terms of 2 years. So Anthony Sutton was just re-elected as our MPO board chair for his 2nd term. And William High, who's joining us today, just started his 1st term as the chair of the TCC. Another thing to note is that we have a bit of an interesting way of counting quorum, and that is it's based on active membership. So we have a very large board. We used to have the largest board of any MPO in the state. We've fallen to 3rd, and I am A-okay with that. We once had a board chair that we got coffee, and he was like, you should try to have coffee with all the board members, maybe once a month or so. That would be an extreme amount of coffee. My kidneys are not ready. And I don't know if I'd ever do work. But just to note, with the way our quorum is counted, if people miss 2 consecutive meetings, they are considered inactive, so they no longer count towards quorum. You can still attend meetings, and as soon as you started attending, you can vote, but you won't count towards quorum. It's been a little while since we've had quorum issues. It's been a few years now.
It's been a few years, it's like 4 years since we've had quorum.
Wow. But our quorum, the amount of members that we need to attend our meetings to get quorum, it does tend to fluctuate. And it's fuzzy math, I think is the term that's sometimes used. So going back to kind of the basic definition of what is an MPO, So we've talked about how it's a forum for cooperative transportation decision-making, but the other part is for the metropolitan planning area. What on earth is that? The first thing to know is there's a couple of different definitions that are very similar but important and distinct. The first, the metropolitan planning area, that is the area that is determined to be part of the MPO. That's anything within the metropolitan planning area that falls into MPO requirements. And then there's the UCA, or the urbanized area. That is a designation developed by the U.S. Census Bureau. And those two definitions play a big role, or the UCA plays a big role in determining metropolitan planning area, but those two areas are different, and the way that they're used are different as well. A little more on the UCA and planning area. So the MPO in general does not draw the boundaries of the urban area. That is done by the U.S. Census Bureau. The MPO's planning area is required to encompass at least the existing urban area defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, as well as what's expected to become urbanized within a 20-year forecast period. So we take the urban area as well as what's expanding, or what we anticipate to expand to become urban. So this is the yellow and green in this map is the urban area as determined by the U.S. Census Bureau in 2020. And just to note, this map actually shows a few urban areas. So there's the Asheville urban area, which is in Buncombe and Henderson. There's the Brevard urban area in Transylvania, and the Canton and Waynesville urban areas in Haywood County. And so for us, the Asheville urban area serves as the starting point for determining what our metropolitan planning area is. And then we look at what's expected to urbanize over the next 20 years, and we get to our metropolitan planning area. So that is essentially the MPO's jurisdiction. And it has changed a bit here and there. Just to note, for almost 30 years, the MPO was just within Buncombe County, right around Asheville. In 2000, it expanded to include Henderson and Haywood. And in 2010, it expanded further to include a little bit of Madison County around Mars Hill, and a little bit of Transylvania. In 2020, it contracted due to changes from the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of urbanized areas. So we lost our tiny bit of Transylvania County. I think it was a handful of square miles. But this is our relatively new planning area as of 2023. So, any questions up to this point?
Only the one you just answered about how we lost train.
Oh, okay. And a little bit just to note is, so Haywood County is no longer part of the Asheville urban area, which has some real impacts, especially on their transit funding availability. But the way that we've looked at it is, it appears that if 2 to 3 new houses were to be built between Canton and the Buncombe County line, they will be right back in the Asheville urban area. So our assumption is they will be back in the Asheville urban area relatively soon, assuming the definition stays the same. A little bit on MPO history just in general. So MPOs really kind of started partially due to a lot of the work going on at the federal government, especially under the Eisenhower administration. Dwight Eisenhower initiated a lot of federal highways programs. And as those programs were getting started, there was an increasing recognition that transportation considerations, they have to be more regional. But also, the federal government wants to make sure that its funds were being put towards regional priorities in a plan. The federal government didn't necessarily want to be funding whatever so-and-so thought was really good. They want it to be part of a plan that is vetted through a process. And also just noting that there's lots and lots of needs out there. Funding is not infinite. There's a lot of transportation funding, to be clear, but it's not infinite. And so prioritizing those needs is an important part of what needs to happen for federal funding to flow effectively. And just to note, in terms of kind of the regional considerations as we look at it in our region, there is a lot of cross-county commute flows, cross-jurisdictional across municipalities, but also cross-county. To me, that just kind of highlights that a lot of transportation doesn't just happen within our local government jurisdictions. What we're really talking about are the regional, economic, and other types of connections that really drive people's transportation choices. And so making sure that the region is having a voice in a lot of those funding and prioritization determinations is important. And also just to point out, we like to say our region is getting more regional. Over the last roughly 20 years, every single one of our counties has seen a decrease of the number of people living and working in the same county. So Buncombe County has had one of the smaller decreases, but still significant. And Haywood, Henderson, Transylvania, and Madison, all seeing significant decreases. And just to note, Madison County, the majority of their residents commute across county lines for employment. So for us, we're seeing that trend accelerating. More and more people are commuting generally farther as part of their employment.
Do you have anything that's updated more than the last 6 years?
We do have data on this up through 2022. And I will say that there is no change in the trends. Those present day numbers continue to kind of tick down. I'll also note that part of that is telecommuting. So this data is based on where people live and where their employer is. So not necessarily all of them are driving to where their employer is. But to me, it kind of shows that there's that important economic connection that is crossing county boundaries. But part of the MPO's responsibility is helping to balance those regional considerations with the local perspective. And so as a lot of freeways and the interstate highway system was being built, there was a number of freeway revolts that happened that either held up or fully canceled interstate projects across the country. And so part of that led to a recognition that having a bunch of engineers in a smoky dark room drawing lines through communities might not be the best way to plan your transportation network. And so a big part of the MPO is looking at what our region needs, but also looking at how does that impact the people who might be living and working along some of those corridors, and trying to find the best balance that we can to make sure we're having an effective project, but also one that does the best that it can to be sensitive to the local context. But in terms of the legal origin, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1962, that was the first time there was a federal requirement for urban transportation planning. MPOs didn't become federally required for another 10 years, but the Act of 1962 really helped kind of catalyze the process of moving towards the MPOs and the metropolitan planning process. And just to note, this MPO, the French Broad River MPO, has been around since 1966. So it existed before MPOs were really fully required. And one way that a lot of people try to sum up, what the federal government was requesting from MPOs in the metropolitan planning process is the 3C process: continuous, comprehensive, and cooperative. So there's a lot that goes into metropolitan planning and all the different documents we work through. But all in all, the different processes and documents are trying to get at this core idea of having a planning process that's comprehensive, that's cooperative, and continuous. So just recognizing that there's a lot of things to consider as you're planning. There's a lot of people and stakeholders that should be involved, and it should be continuous because priorities change. As we've seen, we've had a couple of times now where a council has fully changed, and what was a priority beforehand was something that became a priority to get rid of. And so that is part of what we do, is reconsider what our priorities are. So having a continuous process, i.e. updating our required documents every couple of years, is an important part of what we do. And just to note on this one, there's 3 C's, but none of these C's stand for cookie. Cookies and food are not eligible expenses for MPO funds. So my deepest apologies. When I was in planning school, I was told people come for food and pay for the meeting, but we're not allowed to provide food. Our funders do not, they don't allow it. And just a little bit on some of the major laws, the federal laws, especially since 1990, that help determine what MPOs are required to do. In 1991, the ICE-T, Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, that was the bill that really started to move US DOT and federal highways from just highways into other modes as well and other considerations. So a little more on multimodal transportation. In 1999, North Carolina mandated comprehensive transportation plans, or CTPs. We'll talk more about that. And I'll just jump ahead. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, also known as the Bipartisan Transportation Infrastructure Law. That is the current transportation law. That is set to expire in late 2026. And that is the current law that determines federal funding amounts, federal programs under US DOT, as well as metropolitan planning requirements. So, getting into requirements. Where do MPO requirements come from? By and large, they come from Congress and the federal government. So I won't jump too far into this, but just a refresher from civics class. If anyone had civics class, there's the statutes and regulations that come out of Congress passing legislation and appropriating funds. And then there are guidance documents, circulars that come from the executive office to help implement the legislation. And then below that are the administrative policies and procedures that a lot of the agencies, including USDOT and its subsets, develop based on all of those different levels of regulations and guidance. But all in all, for us and metropolitan planning, we are required to establish a setting for effective decision-making. So making sure that the people we have at the board is who we need to have at the board. Identify and evaluate transportation improvement options. Prepare and maintain a metropolitan transportation plan. That is the 25-year plan for the region. We'll talk more about that. Develop a transportation improvement program. That is the document that reflects what projects are actually funded, not just planned. Identify performance, measure targets, and monitor their progress, and involve the public in our decision-making process. Any questions at this point? Okay. So planning and plans. The first one, the Unified Planning Work Program. Our board chair refers to it as the UPWIP. That is what we consider one of our 3 primary products. And it essentially serves as the MPO's budget. So this is a federally required document, and in general, what it does is it looks at what MPO staff is planning to do over the next fiscal year. It looks at how we're going to fund that with our federal and local sources and a teensy bit of state sources. It looks at what special studies the MPO is funding, potentially including corridor studies through the MPO. There are a number of different funding sources. I won't go too far into this, but our region receives roughly about $350,000 per year of metropolitan planning funds that come from FHWA. And that is really what pays for MPO staff. It helps keep the lights on, gives us computers that usually work, most of the time work. So that is kind of one of our main sources of funds. I'll also point out the MPO receives a little over $4 million in surface transportation block grant funds. We supplement our planning funds with some of those funds for staff, lights, computers, things of that nature. So those are kind of the 2 main funding sources that help fund the MPO. But the UPWP also requires that metropolitan planning funds from FTA be reflected. Those funds go to the city of Asheville for transit planning programs. And there's also state planning and research funds. I don't think have utilized those since I've been here, but if we were to ever get those funds through NCDOT, then that would be required to be in the UPWP. A little bit less on administration, a little more on what our board members and our local governments can use planning funds for and kind of, help get your transportation projects moving. We try to set aside about $500,000 per planning cycle that goes towards local plans. There is a required 20% local match. To note, there's a 20% local match required as part of the MPO's administrative funds as well. Thank you to our dues-paying members. And using the MPO planning funds, MPO and NCDOT staff participation is required. We do not just come with jumbo checks to fund plans. And in general, the scope that is put into the UPWP, that is what's required to be in the project. Just to make sure that what we're expecting to fund is what actually is moved forward. And then following MPO state and federal procurement policies. But all in all, folks can apply to the MPO to do a number of planning studies. I think one of the most popular things is looking at feasibility studies, which is looking at a prospective project and trying to understand it better before moving into engineering and construction. I will just note that if there are projects out there that folks are dreaming of pursuing construction funds for, I highly, highly, highly recommend doing feasibility studies before jumping into federal funds. We've had a number of projects that they've jumped into engineering and construction, found a whole bunch of issues, had to revise their budgets, revise their scopes, and gone through a whole lot of paperwork and heartburn that potentially could have been avoided had there been a feasibility study beforehand. I know there's a general saying out there that, we don't want to have plans sitting on shelves. I totally agree. But at the same time, we don't want to have projects moving forward where there's an immense amount of uncertainty. I can talk about this for a long time, but all in all, it's especially in these times of rising cost considerations, we want to know what we're getting into as best we can before we fund a project. That avoids cost uncertainty, administrative uncertainty, and all kinds of problems down the road. But besides feasibility studies, the MPO planning funds can fund bike-ped plans, socioeconomic projections, corridor studies, small area plans, environmental justice studies, at least for now, traffic studies, and economic impact studies. So there's a number of things that you can use planning funds for. And I won't read through all of these, but we have funded a lot of studies over the last roughly 8 years. And so that is one of kind of the perks of MPO membership is having a source of funding that's available to help get your study or your potential projects lined up, either through plans that identify projects or from feasibility studies that learn a little bit more about what a project is expected to do. And besides MPO planning funds, I'll also note that there's other planning funds that are out there that can do similar things. The NCDOT multimodal planning grants or bike-ped planning grants, that is currently open. So local governments can apply to do bicycle and pedestrian plans. Our region is almost totally covered now. I think almost all of our local governments have done bike-ped plans, I think with 2 exceptions. But all in all, we've done very well as a region in pulling down those funds. There's also NCDOT feasibility studies and express designs. And there's also some discretionary grants from the federal government that are out there to help fund planning considerations. But all in all, what I advise people as the UPWP goes before the MPO board is, the main consideration is the UPWP providing the resources needed to help advance projects and enhance planning efforts? Are we putting our funds where we need them to go in the planning realm? Any questions on the UPWP? Okay. So now planning for projects, which Zoom is the reason most people are here. So this is a chart that we lovingly call the onion. And that looks at the various layers of planning that go into developing transportation projects. That starts as far out as possible with the state's 25-year plan, currently the 2050 plan. And then you get into the CTP, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, MTP, prioritization, all the way down until you get your project constructed. There's lots of layers of planning to get through. Yes, we call it the onion in part because it makes some people cry. But it's important to understand. So a little bit on some of these layers of the onion. NC Moves 2050. Again, that is kind of the state's long-range plan. It establishes a long-term vision for the state with goals and strategies. But I'll note that it is a very, very high-level plan. And so it says things like, we want to be a great trail state. It doesn't get into what trails would make it a great trail state. It just says part of what we want to do as a state is be a great trail state. So it has a lot of those high-level recommendations that are supposed to filter down into the next layers of where we focus some of our funding and efforts. And to note, there is a very large public engagement part of the NC Moves plan. But really where you start to see transportation projects is the CTP, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan. That is where transportation needs are identified. So that plan basically is a giant wish list of all the potential projects that are out there. The MTP starts to look at all of those identified needs, looks at how much money is expected, and prioritizes those needs. And then the TIP prioritizes that further and gets actual funding on your projects. So I'll note that that is one of the more popular documents. So a little bit on CTPs, the Comprehensive Transportation Plans. Just to note, that is a state requirement, not a federally required document. In general, those documents are developed, led by NCDOT, but for CTPs, it does require adoption from the MPO as well as the Board of Transportation. There's no real fiscal constraints. Again, it's more of a wish list of everything that's kind of out there. But things that are in the CTP must meet the problem statement threshold. There has to be a problem that is identified that needs to be addressed. In general, what that looks like, this is a clip from our current CTP. It is, again, just very high level. It shows the purpose and need of the project, but there's little detail in terms of what exactly a project would do to address those needs and what the potential impacts are. And just to note, we're trying to make people's lives simpler, I hope. We currently have a consultant that is updating our CTP and our MTP, and we are just combining them into one document. And that document would be, here's the priorities, and here's everything else that essentially serves as the CTP. one long-range plan. That's the dream. But that is currently moving forward and due in September. But with the CTP, kind of the main board consideration is, are the projects in the CTP worth considering for funding in the future? Are these really the needs? You know, I think that at the CTP level, that's a good time to kind of point out things like if you're hearing from your community that no one wants this corridor improved, let's get it out of the CTP. Let's not even have that considered if the rest of the MPO agrees. But also, if there's a need out there that is on the list, let's make sure it gets on the list. Moving on to the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or the MTP. That is the plan that prioritizes identified projects in the region based on current and future needs. So we look 25 years into the future and try to project and anticipate the future needs for our region. We look at the projects from the CTP, but also other other projects and local plans, as well as other projects that sometimes get into the mix, and kind of filter them through how much funding is anticipated over the next 25 years. And just to note, the MTP is kind of the first document that has a requirement that if there's a project out there that wants to get federal funds or needs federal authorization, it needs to be in the MTP. Otherwise, those funds and authorizations cannot flow to it. So that is a very important consideration. So just to note, an example of kind of that regulatory power, and about 4 years ago, NCDOT had a project that would put a new interchange on I-26 in Buncombe County. The project kind of came out of roughly nowhere, but it was part of an economic development project. And they said, you know, great news, we're going to fund this interchange. And our board, you know, they were like, we're going to fund this interchange, we need you to put it in the MTP so it can move forward. Our board asked, well, where are you getting the funds for this interchange? And the answer was, well, we're going to take it from other projects in the region. And our board did not, they weren't too excited about that part. So they declined to put the project in the MTP. So the project had to be reworked and find different funding that wasn't coming from other local projects in the region. And then once that happened, our board agreed to put it in the MTP and it moved forward. And that is set to be the new interchange by Pratt & Whitney in South Buncombe County. So an important document in terms of actually getting funding flowing and moving projects forward. What's in the MTP? There's a lot of things. Mission, vision, goals, and objectives. Kind of looking at things high level and what do we want to do as a region for a successful transportation network. Looking at growth trends, including land use, population, and employment, travel and economic activity, and looking at where our region is expected to go over the next 25 years. Looking at our transportation network for different needs, including safety, congestion, and other potential needs, and financial planning. So how much money do we anticipate in the next 25 years to actually implement things? And then project impacts. I have no idea why Microsoft PowerPoint put a drone, but the MTP is required to put in potential mitigation efforts and public input. So just to note, we are currently working on our MTP, and we have public meetings coming up the week of April 7th. And so we'll have meetings in Hendersonville, Canton, and Asheville as part of that plan. But again, the big thing, all federally funded projects or projects that need federal actions are required to be in the MTP. And there's also a number of planning factors that the federal regulations require to be looked at as part of the MTP. I won't go through all of these, but just to note, that's part of comprehensive planning, is looking at a number of different things about how our transportation network works and what are the potential things that we need to do to address that. One that I did not add in there that is relatively new is looking at housing issues throughout the region. That is something, for those of you who know me, I'm an irresponsible housing nerd. Housing and our housing issues and patterns play a huge role in our transportation network, I would argue. The cross-county commuting and employment that we touched on earlier, to me, that goes directly back to the housing decisions and the housing situation that is going on in our region. We are seeing that people are going where housing is cheaper, but the costs of transportation are generally higher, and a lot of the transportation services that are provided are generally fewer. So just to note, that is a big one. Financial planning, I won't get too into the weeds. This is a lot of, I would say, borderline crystal ball exercising. But in general, there are rules about financial planning for our 25-year plan about what we can say is a reasonable assumption or not. So we know that there's a number of things going on right now, like the reliance on gas tax is not going great, especially with cars getting more fuel efficient, more people going to electric vehicles. So having a lot of the funding for transportation coming from the gas tax, we know that that is going to have a decreasing return. But we also can't just make up potential rules and potential taxes. As much as I would love to throw some taxes out there and get more transportation funds, that's above my pay grade. But in general, what we're seeing is a lot of transportation funding is struggling to keep up with inflation, and that's what we're seeing kind of playing out right now, is costs are going up, revenues are not keeping up.
Like an endless cycle, and projects get kicked down the road, the longer it takes to occur, then the costs just keep going up.
Exactly. And so one of our former members, Bill Lapsley, he was actually part of a statewide study, the NC First Commission, that looked at a number of potential alternative ways for North Carolina to look at revenue generation. So they looked at things like vehicle miles traveled taxes, which is taxing people based on how much they travel, rather than just how much gas they consume. It looked at things like taxing based on vehicle weight. Just FYI, vehicle weight plays a very large role in terms of how much roads get worn down, need to be maintained. And it actually had two of the recommendations that did move forward was moving some sales tax revenues from the general fund over to transportation to reflect people buying windshield wipers and motor oils, things like that. They estimated how much sales tax was coming from those sources, and that's moving to transportation. And also fees for EVs. So electric vehicles do get a special charge in North Carolina to essentially try to get to how much they would pay. A lot of people argue it's more than they would pay if they just paid the gas tax or something equivalent, but Anyway, so those are items that move forward from the first commission. Another important part of the MTP is the travel demand model. It is a very exciting function, but the travel demand model is something that's set up to essentially mirror our region's transportation network. And as we project growth, the model helps to tell us and inform us how growth is going to impact the transportation network. So if we're anticipating, a large amount of growth in East Henderson County, how does that impact 64, I-26, things like that? It helps to really inform us on where emerging congestion issues are, but it can also be used to help highlight how potential solutions might impact the overall network. But all in all, with the MTP, I think kind of the main consideration is looking at that project list. Is this project or are these projects the priorities for us? The MTP really serves as kind of one of the big points for MPO staff in terms of what projects we really need to try to push forward and get funded. And so we want to make sure that our board is in line with that project list. All right, moving into the TIP. Anna, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So the next phase after a project is identified in the MTP and it receives funding is it goes into the TIP or the TIP. The TIP is the Transportation Improvement Program, and it helps us determine the best available transportation funding for the region. There's also a document called the STIP, which is the State Transportation Improvement Program, and the STIP and TIP go hand in hand. The STIP is a 10 years, both state and federally mandated plan that identifies the construction funding and schedule of transportation projects. A note that the federal requirement for STIPs is 4 years. However, NCDOT uses a 10-year document. And the only other state in the country that uses a 10-year document is Rhode Island, fun fact. So the STIP and TIP include funding, scope, and schedules for highway projects, aviation, bike ped, ferry, public transportation, rail, and the governor's highway safety and statewide programs. And the STIP is organized by the 14 transportation divisions in the state, as well as statewide projects. So the TIP is the MPO's subset of the STIP. So the TIP is the moon and the STIP is the earth. The TIP is maintained by the MPO, and the TIP and STIP must match in project, schedule, scope, and order of funds to be authorized. The TIP is developed from projects that are prioritized in the MTP, and our TIP is updated every 2 years. So the TIP assigns specific funding to implement a project. It covers 4 to 10 years, and the TIP is approved by the MPO board and the governor, and it reflects all regionally significant projects in the MPO. So like I said before, that includes highway, bike ped, transit, and rail. We don't have any ferry projects, unfortunately. So TIP changes. The TIP must match the STIP in project schedule and scope. And amendments are substantial changes made by the request of DOT or the MPO, which is brought before the MPO's TCC and board on a quarterly basis right now, but you all will be seeing more TIP amendments in the future. We're going to try and move those to monthly modifications and amendments moving forward, or every other month. So an amendment is a substantial change, and a modification is a minor or administrative change, also initiated by either DOT or the MPO. And the changes go out for public comment. TIP amendments require a 20-day public comment period before the MPO board approves. A substantial change to the TIP includes addition or deletion of projects, a change in scope that changes the termini, the project type, the purpose, number of lanes, significant cost increases greater than $2 million or 25% of the original cost, changes to NEPA. Basically, any large-scale change to a project is required to be processed as an amendment. And then a modification is a minor change in a project, more of an informal change. Public hearing and public notice are not required for TIP modifications. And modifications include like a minor change to the scope, sponsor funding or descriptions, a funding change less than $2 million or less than 25% of the original project cost, data entry, if the TIP does not align with the state's TIP, the project may not move forward. And that's not just specific to that one project in the TIP. If one project doesn't match the TIP, all the projects don't match. So that's what the nuclear, it's like a nuclear option is when the TIP does not match the STIP, we cannot move forward with any of the projects that we currently have.
That's pretty severe.
It is. That's why there's a rather dramatic slide on here. It's what we consider our nuclear option. And that is, if there's a project that our communities really, really don't want, that the state is pushing forward, this is our option to stop it. It is, I would say, seldom used at the MPO. I think the last time we used it was 2014, when there was a lot of discussion about the New Leicester Highway widening project. But it is it's an option that is there. It's there for a reason. But ideally, we try to avoid that because moving our projects forward is generally better, especially if it's projects we want.
What was the project that you said happened in 2014?
So it was the widening of New Leicester Highway. I was just starting and kind of came in midway. But my understanding is, in general, NCDOT wanted to widen New Leicester. Our board felt like that was not a priority project. And there were some concerns about the design of the project. So there was a large disagreement about how to move that forward. And the MPO board voted to remove that project from the TID, which essentially stopped it. And then there were further negotiations about the project, and it eventually came back into the TID. Well, I guess there's one other example, I guess, that it didn't quite happen, but a few years ago, there was a project in Flat Rock, the Highland Lake Road project. That was a project that was the priority of the village for years and years. It got funded, it moved into design, and I believe it moved into right-of-way. And then the village council changed and didn't want the project. And so they called for a vote to remove the project from the TIP, which, if they were successful, that would have stopped the project. But the MPO board voted, it was somewhat split, but it voted to keep the project in the TIP and keep it moving forward, despite the village's concerns. So it's an option that's there, especially if there's projects that people really don't want or have some kind of issue with. But all in all, when folks are looking at the TIP, you know, one of the main considerations is, are the projects in the TIP that are moving forward in line with what the MPO wants? I phrased that very vaguely on purpose. There's a number of things that can go into that. Whether that is the MPO feels like, you know, there are other projects that should be funded instead, or if they really don't want that project. That's part of what should be considered as we look at things like adopting a new TIP amendments, or TIP modifications. But I think just to zoom out really quick, in terms of the MTP and the TIP, I try to liken those to, you know, the MTP is basically the MPO's comprehensive plan. And the TIP is essentially the UDO, or the zoning ordinance. To me, that's the best way I can liken these documents to similar planning processes with local governments. All right. Are there any questions at this point? Quiet bunch. Okay. Moving into the funding. So a little bit on federal funding. Federal funding plays an important part in our transportation considerations. Just to note, there is more than $3.3 billion of federal funds planned to be used in our region over the next 10 years. That's a lot of funding. And so federal funds are very important in the overall picture of improving our transportation network. Something to note at the federal level is the federal gas tax has not been increased since William Jefferson Clinton in 1993. And so pretty much since 2007, FY 2008, the federal government has been transferring more and more funding from general revenues into the Highway Trust Fund. So just to note, that's an important thing with federal funds and revenues. In terms of federal funding, there's 6 different agencies under USDOT. There's 4 that we deal with either frequently or semi-frequently. So FHWA, that is the Federal Highway Administration. FTA, that's the Federal Transit Administration. FRA, the Federal Rail Administration. And FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration. So all of those agencies, they have different funding streams, funding programs, and different requirements and potential uses in terms of coordination. This is just a fun chart that I found that a lot of highway as well as public transportation funding coming from the federal government. A lot of funding, goes to both modes, but just to note, a whole lot of that funding does go into highway programs. And an important thing to look at with federal funds, especially with some of the considerations going on in DC right now, is a lot of programs you can break down into 2 different categories. One is formula funds. Those are funds that are federal transportation funds that are distributed to states and metropolitan areas based on formulas. So that is essentially funding that goes out to state DOTs and MPOs and says, here's what you can use these funds for, here's how much you get, use them as essentially you see fit within those rules. And the other kind of flavor of funding is discretionary funding. And those are funds that are made available through federal grant programs that are awarded to specific projects. So a lot of those are projects like the Acoustic Trail, the Pratt and Whitney interchange that we touched on earlier, that received a discretionary grant. So those are programs where they ask for grant applications to come for specific projects, and then the federal government selects which projects best meet their criteria. Important to keep in mind. Moving into the state and a little bit of context with the French Broad River MPO. One important thing about North Carolina that everyone should know, everybody, not just MPO people, there are no county roads in North Carolina. I've been told there's a couple of exceptions, but it's literally a couple of exceptions. At the time of the Great Depression, the state helped to intervene with a lot of county financial issues and took over county roads. And so North Carolina, as a result, has the second largest road network in, it should be the country, not the county. Second largest road network in the country behind Texas. And so looking at what that means in terms of transportation, that means that North Carolina and NCDOT play a very, very, very large role in all things transportation. A lot of the roads that we rely on are state-maintained roads, and that is somewhat unique, and that also kind of changes the way the MPO works as well. A lot of MPOs in other states, the way they work is there's local governments, county governments, and state government all kind of vying for federal funds, and the MPO works to essentially distribute funding where it's most needed. In North Carolina, it's a little bit different. It's a much closer connection with the state DOT, and making sure that our local governments are on board with what's moving forward at the state level. And just to note, state funding is not allowed to go towards standalone bicycle and pedestrian projects. That is part of state law. But in our region, just looking at our infrastructure picture, we have 11 miles of bike lanes in the MPO planning area. We have 25 miles of greenways and just a hair over 660 miles of sidewalks. In terms of roads, we have 10,305 miles of roads. More than 4,088 of those miles are state roads. 5,432 miles are privately maintained, and 785 miles are municipal roads. So just a quick picture on our region. For NCDOT and its funding picture, about 75% of all the funds that are part of DOT's budget come from state sources. That is a relatively high amount compared to a lot of other states, but I think that's also keeping in mind that the state has the second largest system in the country and plays a very large role in transportation. And about 25% of all of its funds come from federal sources. In general, the state splits up its highway funding into two different pots. There's the highway fund that focuses on maintenance activities, bridge replacements, resurfacing, paving unpaved roads, and things like that. And to note, as part of the highway fund, there's also the Powell Bill program. Powell Bill funding is a set aside of funds that annually goes to municipalities with a municipal road network for them to help maintain. But that funding has some other eligibilities as well for potential transportation improvements. There's also the Highway Trust Fund, and that focuses on capital improvements programmed through the state's prioritization process that we will get into. But when we talk about the TIP, the MTP, a lot of what we're talking about are those capital improvement projects that are the focus of Highway Trust Fund revenues. And I won't jump into all of this, but this is where a lot of the funding comes from and where it goes to in North Carolina in terms of the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund. Just to note, while the federal funds are only 25% of the overall revenues, they are a much larger percent of the Highway Trust Fund. So a lot of those improvement projects are much more reliant on the federal funding. And to note, somewhat recently, the state had sales tax that was added to their revenue picture. So transferring a percent of sales tax to both the Highway Fund and the Highway Trust Fund is one of the things the General Assembly and the governor did a few years ago to try to help increase the amount of transportation funds.
20%? Did you say a percentage?
I believe it's around 5%, but let me double check on that. So one type of federal funds, and these are all formula funds that come to the MPO, that I definitely want folks to be aware of, that goes into our locally administered projects. And yes, there's a bunch of acronyms. But the MPO is considered a TMA, or a transportation management area. With that comes greater responsibilities, but it also comes with formula funds from the federal government. So we receive about $4.7 million a year from a program called Surface Transportation Block Grant. That is a very large transportation program at USDOT with a lot of eligibilities. Those funds can be used for road projects on functionally classified roads, bike ped projects, and transit capital projects, amongst other things. But in general, there's a lot that we can do with our Surface Transportation Block Grant funds, or our SDBG-DA. But keep in mind, it's $4.7 million a year. Can't exactly widen a highway with that. But there are a lot of kind of smaller transportation projects that we have and we can fund. There's also the Transportation Alternatives Program that is primarily focused on bicycle and pedestrian projects. Our region receives about $500,000 per year. And there is the Carbon Reduction Program. That is a brand new program from the Inflation Reduction Act. We receive about $300,000 per year. And that goes towards bike ped projects, transit capital projects, as well as EV projects.
Why are those overlapping? You know what I'm saying? Like bike ped projects and all three categories.
Right. So
the transit capital projects.
So we kind of take these three funds and we use them for our local projects, but they all have different eligibilities. So the Surface Transportation Block Grant, we can use for intersection improvements, adding turn lanes or roundabouts and things like that. We cannot use our Transportation Alternatives Program for that. So that has to be, we use our Transportation Alternatives funds for sidewalks, greenways, things like that. So there's a lot of similarity and overlap between the three funding programs, but it's not a total overlap. for all of them. So in general, with these funds, a 20% local match is required. And we have a competitive selection process in the MPO. So we request project applications from NCDOT and our local governments. And we go through and select the projects that would be funded with those different funding programs. To note, there are lots of federal requirements. And so we always caution people, don't try to use these funds for very small projects. When I first got to the MPO about 10-ish years ago, one of our jurisdictions was furious that they got a crosswalk project funded with these funds, and they noted that they spent far more time and money dealing with the federal requirements than was actually spent on the crosswalk. So I always caution people, if you're going to go after these funds, make sure it's worth it. Federal requirements they're no joke. Also, as part of having these funds, NCDOT oversight is required. So any project that has these federal funds attached, there's going to be DOT oversight. In general, DOT requires that 10% of the project funds go to DOT oversight. If DOT manages the project, it's generally about 15% of the project costs go to DOT. And there are review periods throughout the project development process to make sure that people are using funds the right way and not trying to, buy them and their family members a bunch of cyber trucks. Just to note. But in general, we get applications, the MPO goes through and selects and programs the projects into the TIP. And then once the projects are programmed in the TIP and the STIP, there's a DOT agreement with local governments. And then the local project can move forward. We have a ton of projects currently on the books in varying stages of progress. A few projects that have been completed relatively recently, Hendersonville Road sidewalks, the French Broad River West Greenway in Asheville, the Onteora Drive sidewalks, the NC 110 roundabout in Canton, New Leicester Highway sidewalks just right outside of Land Sky offices, Broadway Street sidewalks, and pedestrian signal improvements at Charlotte Street and I-240, as well as a couple of buses that were purchased. Some exciting projects that are moving forward and should be opening relatively soon. One is the Haywood Road Bicycle and Pedestrian Improvement Project, and also a resurfacing project that NCDOT Division 13 is leading. And then the Acosta Trail project in Henderson County. The MPO has roughly $22 million from our local project funding on the Acosta Trail. So a lot of great projects that were priorities from our local governments. Moving into SPOT, or the statewide prioritization process. This is where the big money is. Just to note, a lot of people refer to the prioritization process as SPOT. What SPOT actually stands for is the Strategic Prioritization Office of Transportation at NCDOT. But in general, this process is how NCDOT programs the majority of their federal and state transportation funds for capital improvements. This is a very important process in terms of getting projects and distributing funds. It's a process that was determined by the Strategic Transportation Investments Act of 2012 that called for a transparent and data-driven prioritization process to determine what projects would be funded. It's funding not just for highway, but potentially for bike ped and transit capital projects as well. But in general, just about every major highway project that is being talked about, its funding came from the spot process or the prioritization process. In general, the way that it works is it takes the funding that's available and it splits it into 3 different funding tiers. So 40% of the funds go towards statewide mobility projects that focus on significant congestion and bottlenecks, especially on interstates. Those projects are selected 100% based on data. The next tier, that's the regional impact tier, 30% of funds go to the regional impact tier. They're further distributed to different regions based on population. The focus is improving connectivity within regions, and projects are selected 70% based on data and 30% based on local input from MPOs and NCDOT divisions, and also RPOs, which are the rural planning organizations. And then the last tier is division needs. 30% of funds go to the division needs category. Those funds are further split up amongst the 14 NCDOT divisions. So if you're in Buncombe and Madison, you're in Division 13, Haywood and Henderson, Division 14. And those projects can go on just about any facility that's eligible. So secondary roads, but also this is where bike ped projects are eligible, transit projects, and anything from the other tiers that we feel is important to cascade. So that's why there's these arrows. You can cascade projects down tiers, you cannot cascade them up. So in terms of how the tiers look in terms of the competitive area, for us, our statewide mobility projects, which are essentially all of our projects on I-26 and I-40, they compete across the entire state. And they compete solely based on congestion, safety, and economic development considerations. There is no local input in terms of determining what projects are funded at the statewide mobility level. The following tier, regional impact, that's made up of divisions 13 and 14. So division 13 in blue, division 14 in the pink coral. That is what's considered Region G. And so Region G receives 8.6% of the regional impact funds. That is the second smallest amount of funding to go to a region because that region has the second smallest population of the others across the state. And I will just note that is a very important funding tier for us. Being in the mountains, we have a lot of development that relies on getting people to US and NC highways. And that is, US and NC highways rely on the regional impact tier for improvement. So one thing I will note, we touched on cascading. That is, if a project is considered in statewide mobility and isn't funded, we can cascade it down to try to get it funded in regional impact. I will just note that's something we have done in the past. We have a number of projects that have been cascaded, but we need to be very, very careful about cascading considerations. Overall, the more that we cascade projects, in the long run, we're likely to see less funding overall for the region. So the amount of regional impact and division needs funding is roughly constant. The amount of statewide mobility funds is more about having the most competitive statewide mobility project. And so what we've seen in the past is a lot of those projects, I believe 2 on I-26 were very close to being funded at statewide. And if we waited another round, maybe 2, there would have been a chance for that to be funded in statewide. But those projects were cascaded. And so rather than us having a competitive project at the statewide tier, we got it funded in a different tier rather than having that funding go to other projects. But it's one of those cases where it's, you know, there is, at the MPO, I understand that there are pressures that elected officials are under to make sure that they try to get priorities funded as quickly as possible. And there's other considerations of one project we cascaded was done with the hopes that if we had multiple projects moving together at the same time, there'd be the opportunity for cost savings. In general, with the process, there's a lot that we undertake, and this is something that we will be undertaking this summer. The MPO and NCDOT divisions and RPOs submit projects. We have a set number of projects that we can submit for funding consideration. So that list is generally developed by our prioritization subcommittee, and then it's brought to the TCC and board for approval. From there, once projects are submitted, they go through quantitative scoring, where the state looks at things like congestion, safety, economic development benefit, and provide a score for the project. Statewide mobility projects are programmed just based on the score. For regional impact projects, the MPO, RPO, and NCDOT divisions determine where their local input points will go to help boost a project and make it more likely to be funded. Then regional impact projects are programmed. We go through the same local input point process for division needs. And then from there, we get a new draft TIP and STIP that's required to be passed by both the MPO as well as the Board of Transportation, and the final STIP is adopted. But in general, we try to make sure that we advertise the list of projects that are being submitted so that the public and stakeholder is aware of all the projects we're talking about, whether that's capacity projects on our interstates, safety projects on a lot of our arterials, passenger rail between Salisbury and Asheville is one of the big considerations, bike ped improvements, and transit capital improvements. But again, all of this process is a big part of what goes into developing the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program. That's the ultimate end goal of this process. And I'll just note, we have a great tool for looking up projects, their funding, their description, their schedule. Please check it out on our website. Can we highlight that on the front page?
Website?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. It is it's much better than the eye-numbing spreadsheet we had several years ago. But again, just to note, a lot of the projects coming out of the prioritization process, those are a lot of the big projects that are discussed, whether that's the I-26 connector project, I-26 widening, Wananoa River Roads, Sweeten Creek, Future 26, US 64. Those are all projects that at some point went through the prioritization process. And being part of the continuous planning process, you know, we relook at what projects are being considered every 2 years as we go through this process. Coming up, make sure that the projects that you think our priorities are getting onto this list? Another thing to point out as part of this process is there is a highway, non-highway split. So with all the funding at NCDOT, there is a policy that 90%, a minimum of 90% of the funding goes towards highway projects. And there is a requirement that a minimum 6% of funding go to non-highway projects. And just to note, non-highway includes aviation, bike ped, ferry, rail, and transit projects. The remaining 4% of funding is an open competition. I will say I have the pleasure of serving on the state prioritization work group, which helps determine a lot of these things. We recently changed the non-highway minimum from 4% to 6%. Wouldn't think that's a huge deal, but that took months and months and months of discussion. But something to, well, and I guess one other note before we move on is the majority of the non-highway funding actually goes to rail. A lot of the rail projects are what get that 6%. Really quickly, IIJA grants. The latest federal transportation bill that came out in 2021, one of the big changes is it put together tons and tons of discretionary grants. Discretionary grants, there were relatively few in previous transportation bills. The IIJA, there's a lot more discretionary grants. But to note, a lot of those are being reviewed by the new administration right now. So some of those discretionary grants became available, and then that funding got pulled or paused for review. But some of the ones that are likely to be attractive to our local government, the RAISE program, now it's back to being known as the BUILD program. That is the funding program going, playing a large role in the Acoustic Trail. It also helped fund the city of Asheville's RAD-TIP program. Reconnecting Communities is one program we assisted the city of Hendersonville attempt to go after. Safe Streets for All, we have a Safe Streets for All grant to develop a plan for the region. Protect looks at transportation resilience. Our board had recently approved us going after a Protect planning grant. Just to note, we've heard for years and years that we need more emphasis on resilience in transportation. I think Helene helped highlight that, and then some. But one of the issues with resilience in transportation is there's not a lot of good data. It's really hard to try to prioritize transportation projects based on resilience needs and considerations. That data just doesn't exist in North Carolina in a lot of ways. And so we were hoping to pursue a grant to develop those tools. That funding program was recently pulled for review by the administration. And also the FTA All Stations Accessibility Program. That's one that a couple folks have had interested in try to upgrade their transit stations. But again, Safe Streets for All, we are currently working on a regional safety plan, that's Safe Streets for Western North Carolina. We have meetings with the MTP coming up the week of April 7th. So please, please, please attend to learn more. But we received $400,000 overall from USDOT as well as Dogwood Health Trust. Thank you, Dogwood Health Trust. That helps develop a safety plan for the region. It makes our region eligible to pursue Safe Streets for All implementation funds. And it also really gives us much better tools for evaluating safety needs in our region. A lot of people, they'll be like, well, there's a lot of crashes here. Why don't we focus our safety funding where there's a lot of crashes? And a lot of times that's the way it works, but we have to know that sometimes there are crashes and there's not a great infrastructure solution. There are crashes that have factors besides just the infrastructure. And so the Safe Streets for All plan helps to prioritize and highlight areas where the infrastructure really does need to be upgraded, whether there's crashes or not. Also, raise grants. Custa Trail was awarded more than $20 million in raise funds in 2023. The RAB kit was awarded previously, and that's a program that was formerly known as Tiger, and then it became Build, and then Raise, and now it's Build again. I guess naming, when you're at the federal level, naming programs that's the fun part. That's my guess. And then I'll note local funds. And a quick note on local funds is, we are here to help people get federal funds. But one thing that we already touched on, but if you can build a project without federal funds, my advice is take that route. It is almost inevitably going to be cheaper and easier and move faster. I think overall there's fewer regulations, requirements, challenges, and approvals. But especially with the cost of infrastructure and labor and materials these days, and especially with our local government funding situation post-Helene, we want our local funds to go as far as they can. So that's why the federal funds are there. But if there's a small project, don't be sad if I say you might want to just use local funds. We are trying to help when we say that. All right, public transportation. Daisy, you wanna take it away?
Yeah, go for it. If you don't mind just advancing the slide for me.
Sure.
So I don't have to switch to share the same presentation. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So we saved the exciting part until now, and this is just a brief overview of public transportation and public transportation funding. The transit systems that we have within the French Broad River Metropolitan Planning Organization region are ART, or Asheville Rides Transit, Mountain Mobility, which is Buncombe County's paratransit organization, Apple Country Public Transit, and Apple Country Transportation. Those are both the rural and urban portion of Henderson County Transit. We have Hayload Public Transit, which is operated by Mountain Projects, and then Madison County Transportation Authority. In red, you see the French Broad River MPO region. This is the transit systems as of the regional transit study. And that just shows which areas are currently being served in transit with the different colored lines there. And just a quick refresher of what Tristan was talking about earlier with those formula grants versus discretionary grants. Formula grants are funds that are distributed to every recipient in a group to accomplish the same purpose. And formula grants are not competitive because the funding amount for each recipient is calculated on specific parameters set by Congress. That being said, once a formula grant goes to a recipient, there is a competitive process, which we'll touch on briefly with our 5310 and JARC funding. And then there's also discretionary grants, which are your standard competitive grant process. So the formula grants that we currently operate off of, our transit currently operates off of in the region are Section 5307, which is the Urbanized Area Formula Grant, JARC, or Job Access Reverse Commute, Section 5310, which is Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities, Section 5303, which is Regional Planning Funds for Metropolitan Areas, and Section 5339, which is Bus Facilities. Section 5307 is the funding that funds transit in the urbanized areas. It makes federal resources available to governors and other recipients for transit capital and operating assistance. And this is somewhat of a catch-all for transit funding. If you'll go to the next slide. Eligible recipients are within those urbanized areas that Tristan was speaking about earlier. Within the French Broad River MPO region, we have ART as one of the designated recipients for 5307 funds in the region. And I'm not going to belabor you by going into the slide in detail. You can review it at your leisure later, but it's kind of the meat and potatoes of transit funding in an urban area. And it allows for basically all funding of transit with some exceptions, and the different facets of transit, including capital investments, the software needed to power those investments, capital infrastructure, and most of the supporting financing for transit, urban transit. The way those funds are currently distributed is they come down through the Federal Transit Administration. They pass through the French Broad River MPO, and then they are administered and managed by the City of Asheville, who is the designated recipient for the region, and then further distributed to Buncombe County and Henderson County for the operation of their transit systems. We use a regional allocation to decide how that funding is split up, and Asheville receives 46.9% of the 5307 funds, Buncombe County receives 31.9%, and Henderson County receives 21.2% of those funds. JARC is the Job Access Reverse Commute Program, and it provides funding to develop transportation services to connect welfare recipients and low-income individuals to employment and support services. JARC grants fund planning, capital, and operating costs of projects, as well as costs associated with commute from urban and suburban workplaces. Go to the next slide. And this is just a snapshot of this, our most current JARC funding process, the fiscal year 2024, where we received $412,000, just over $412,000 for JARC funding. The way those funds distributed locally, they go to fund ART Route S3, which goes from the downtown ART station down to the airport, and Route 170, which goes from the ART station to Black Mountain. And then we also have 5310, which funds the enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities. It's designed to support transportation services that are planned, designed, and carried out to meet special transportation needs of seniors. The eligible projects include traditional capital investments and non-traditional investments. And these funds are competitive, and applicants submit proposals annually, and we're currently going through this process now. Again, I won't belabor you with this. We covered that on the last slide. This is just for your reference to understand a little bit more about what 5310 funding can be applied to. Just to differentiate between 5310 and traditional and other versus other funding. So at least 55% of our 5310 funding needs to go to traditional projects, and traditional projects focus primarily on capital investments in public transportation infrastructure and equipment. Some examples are buses, vans, wheelchair lifts, ramps, and transit-related information technology systems and mobility management programs. The other portion of projects, up to 35% of our 5310 funding can be used for this project. And those projects go to traditional capital investments, or go beyond traditional capital investments, including capital investments or operating projects that enhance mobilities for seniors or individuals with disabilities. Examples include travel training, volunteer driver programs, building accessible paths, and improving signage or wayfinding technology. And just a breakdown of what that looks like locally, this year we received $470,000, we received just over $477,000 in 5310 funds. 10% of administrative fee goes to the city of Asheville to help administer those funds. And then the funding available after that administrative fee was just under $430,000. We had $262,659 that could go to the 55% traditional funding, and then an additional $167,000 that could go to that other pot of funds. This is what a typical call for projects for 5310 and JARC looks like. This year we opened up our call for projects in January. It stayed open for just over a month. And then the funding was, the applications were scored by our prioritization subcommittee, who reviewed and made a recommendation to the TCC for project selection. And on March 13th, the TCC approved those selections and made a recommendation to the MPO board. And later this week, the MPO board will be voting on JARC project selection. The other piece to that will come back in May to make sure that all the requisite amendments are made to the TIP to codify those projects. And then 5303 funds are regional funds for metropolitan areas. Asheville receives approximately $150,000 to $200,000 a year in 5303 funds. Asheville pays a 10% match, 80% comes from the federal government, and 10% is paid by the state. So the MPO develops the Unified Planning Work Plan. Asheville provides the 5303 narrative that is added to the UPWP, and then Asheville sends 5303 materials to NCDOT to receive their funding. And other sources of transit funds, we have 5339, and that funds capital projects to replace, rehabilitate, or purchase buses, vans, and related equipment, and to construct bus-related facilities, including technological changes or innovations to modify low or no emission vehicles. And as mentioned earlier, we also have discretionary grants. Just a couple of those are the Capital Investment Program, New Start, Small Starts, Low Emission, No Emission Program, and All Station Accessibility Program. There was a regional transit study that looked at transit within the French Broad River MPO region, and eventually proposed a regional transit authority with limited cross to overcome the availability of limited cross-country trips currently. It proposed 4 regional express routes and then microtransit services at 5 key transit system access points, along with van pools to help improve the transit system. And here we have a map of how that works. You see the red dashed lines that travel along basically the 26 and I-40 corridors, and that would be the express routes. And then the blue lines are services that are provided by each of those localized systems.
All right, any questions on public transportation? There is a lot. There's not enough funding in this realm, but more than enough work. So just to know, with most of the public transportation funding, the decisions of how those funds are distributed are made by the MPO board. And you know, with the regional transit study, that's a study that attempted to get at the fact that because we have these different transit entities somewhat siloed within their counties, our region doesn't have cross-county transit connections. So a lot of the cross-county travel that is being made by public transportation either requires transfers or requires special setup ahead of time to make sure that people can make those connections. And so, you know, our connections between Haywood and Henderson are somewhat simple, but when you actually do it, it takes an enormous amount of time. But Haywood to, say, downtown Asheville actually requires at least 2 transfer points to make that trip. So this study tried to get at, what if we built a transit system that helps supplement our locals and provided those cross-county connections? Because we know, you know, we have more than 12,000 people, 12,000 Henderson County residents employed in Buncombe County, and that number's rising, and we're seeing that in similar ways across the region. How do we provide those cross-county connections? That's what the regional transit study tried to get at. Okay, moving into implementation. I think the first thing to note on this is that this is kind of the stage where a lot of the MPO work starts to taper off. This is implementation in general is much more in DOT realm, specifically with our DOT divisions, Division 13 and 14. I don't think any of us here are good at operating heavy equipment, so that would be a bad idea. But this is kind of obviously the implementing projects and implementing improvements. That is what we are trying to do. So I'm just going to touch on a few important things that's important to keep in mind in planning, as well as just to be aware of. First is the NEPA and merger process. That is a process somewhat unique to North Carolina that focuses on the environmental documentation stage. And projects go into the NEPA merger process when there's competing interests between different agencies. So Wildlife Resources, Army Corps of Engineers, if there are assets or considerations that need to be permitted by those organizations, they're incorporated into the merger process. As part of the merger process, there's a number of concurrence points. So it starts with CP1, which is getting the merger teams, which are all of those agencies, including NCDOT and often the MPO, to agree to the purpose and need of the project, as well as the study area. Following that, looking at the study alternatives moving forward, getting to a preferred alternative that is known as the LEDPA, or the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. And then getting into avoidance and minimization to try to reduce those environmental impacts, hydraulic design review, and finally the permit drawing review. Also a big part of implementation are the traffic forecasts that are done. NCDOT, as projects get into the TIP, they start to work in depth on their traffic forecasts. The forecast can help determine how many lanes are needed for a project to fully address congestion, but it can also just be looking at turn lanes that are needed at intersections, other intersection treatments, and potential signalization to be considered to accommodate future needs. This is where the region's travel demand model serves as kind of the basis for a lot of these traffic forecasts. They look at the model that takes our region's projected growth into account and uses that as a starting point to see what kind of future growth needs to be accommodated on future projects. One thing I get asked a lot with traffic forecasts, do our traffic forecasts and does our model take autonomous vehicles into account? In general, no, not as of right now. I think it's an important question. I think it's something that a lot of people are looking into. But as far as I am aware as of right now, there's not really a safe assumption about what autonomous vehicles are really going to do to impact the transportation network. On the one hand, there's the idea that, maybe there will be one car company and you can dial up a car and the car picks you up. There's another assumption that we would just buy autonomous cars. We would still all own our own cars. Those are very different models. And the other thing is that, you know, there's also the idea that there would be less need for following distance, so we could have more cars on the highway. But there's also, you know, to counter that, there's studies that say autonomous vehicles are likely to make people commute from further away because they won't have to be driving. They can be doing other things, and that could increase overall traffic. There's a lot of unknowns about autonomous vehicles. As Daniel says, we do make an assumption that they won't make an impact in the next 30 years. Thank you, Daniel. But in general, our autonomous vehicles and the potential benefits of them reflected in forecasts in the model, not as of right now, because they could go in various directions. Complete streets, that's an important one for our local governments to be aware of. Just to point out, when we talk about complete streets, we're generally talking about highway projects that have some kind of bicycle, pedestrian, transit, or other component. Standalone bike ped projects are projects where it's just trying to do bicycle and pedestrian improvements. Complete streets is trying to get those improvements as part of a highway project. So it's a little bit different. But in general, NCDOT has had a complete streets policy since 2012. The MPO has had a complete streets policy since 2014. And that means that any project moving forward needs to consider having complete streets treatments. And one of the big considerations is who pays for those complete streets considerations. NCDOT recently updated their complete streets policy. So in general, if a project is identified in a plan, NCDOT covers the cost of that project. So that is part of why we have really encouraged our local governments to make sure they're getting their bike ped plans done, so that if there are critical improvements that can be identified and DOT is upgrading the highway, they make sure that's included. If the complete streets components are not in a plan, but DOT identifies a need, there's cost share. So the local government pays a percentage of the cost of that improvement based on the local government's population.
It says pay full cost.
Well, then there's betterment. Betterments are basically, they're not in a plan, there's not really a need identified, but it's something that the local government has requested. That gets, in those cases, the locals pay the full cost of those treatments. And so to point out, there's a number of opportunities for complete streets, the considerations and additions. The big one is with TIP projects. So there's projects like the 191 widening in Mills River that includes complete streets improvements that the town of Mills River requested. And I'll just note, there tends to be some fair criticism about NCDOT having 90% of their funds going towards highway projects. But just to note, a lot of those highway projects include complete streets components as well. Also maintenance projects. So something we've been doing is trying to line up our what NCDOT's upcoming maintenance projects are, and trying to get complete streets or other improvements as part of those maintenance projects. So on kind of the larger end of things, the Haywood Road resurfacing project, we coordinated with Division 13 to add MPO funds for bicycle and pedestrian improvements. And that's a big win. That's able to utilize DOT funds for cost share and make improvements requested by local governments and their communities on a corridor without the local government having to use their funds.
On Haywood Road here in Asheville.
Yeah.
191's been called. So I thought,
Right.
okay, wait. Okay.
So like, but we have a couple of maintenance projects where we've coordinated, and that coordination has helped yield more funding and more improvements. On the other hand, we've gotten some smaller improvements. So there's one project in or just outside of Canton where we noticed that it was highlighted in the state's safety plans and or safety considerations, and we requested that the state look into just adding a stop sign when they resurface the road. And unless Steve Williams corrects me, I believe that was recently permitted. So now an intersection where there was a number of crashes will get a stop sign, which is help reduce some of the crashes that were observed. And also safety projects. NCDOT has a relatively small set aside of funds for safety projects from federal and state sources. Those projects are programmed solely through the state, looking at crashes and interventions, and some of those have included complete streets projects. Standalone bike ped projects, again, just to note, North Carolina law prohibits state funds from being used for standalone bike ped projects. So almost every single bike ped project in our region is funded with a combination of federal and local funds. And again, those are projects where it's just putting in bicycle and pedestrian improvements. There's not really a highway component. And then finally, resilience. To note, NCDOT has a resilience policy that was recently developed. And so that is really focused on bridge replacements, but on other projects as well. It works somewhat similarly to the Complete Streets policy, which is resilience and resilience improvements have to be considered, especially if needs are identified. And so there is, especially in our region, you know, dealing with the aftermath of Helene, we want to do what we can to make sure that our infrastructure is resilient, and we're helping to make sure that there are limited threats in the future to communities being isolated, to critical infrastructure being cut off. And so that is something that I think there will be a lot more conversations at a number of levels moving forward. Yeah, that is something that I think is going to be critical for our region. DOT has developed their resilience plan, which helps to prioritize improvements across the state. So that is something. That is our overview of the MPO and the transportation planning process. Are there any questions? We are well under 7 hours.
How do you feel accomplished for that?
It's been tough.
Miss Doubtfire, hello.
Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I will just zoom back really quick. Yes, there's things, a lot of this stuff, it's going to take some time for it to soak in, and asking questions is always a good idea. If anything pops up, if there's ever an agenda item that you have questions about, please feel free to reach out to us, to the NCDOT division, Steve Williams, Hannah Smith, I was the division planning engineers. They are very, very helpful. We try to be very helpful. So please, please, please reach out, ask questions, and if there's anything we can do to help you or your local government, let us know.
Thanks, Tristan. Drew Stevens here from Biltmore Forest. Just I had to drop off. Would definitely be interested in catching the recording if you're going to send that out to everybody.
Yeah, I think we'll get that posted on the MPO's YouTube page. Please subscribe. We'll send out a link to everyone on the call today and make sure folks have it, and it'll be on the MPO website.
Thank you so much.
How many subscribers are we up to? 5 subscribers. We've gone viral, folks.
Yeah, but I do.
But we'll get 6.
I'll have to do that.
Okay. Well, folks, thank you so much. I know this has been a lot. But again, whatever we can do to help put you all in the best position possible for making decisions, that's what we're here for. Okay. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. Bye for now.